The awakening. The sterile hospital room was silent, broken only by the mechanical hum of life support machines. Fluorescent lights cast an eerie glow on the walls, reflecting the harsh reality of the situation. Emily Dawson had been in a coma for 5 years. Her small body, once full of life, now lay still, her auburn hair fanned out on the pillow beneath her. To an outsider, she might have seemed at peace, but to those who knew her, the scene was unbearable. The machines may have been keeping her body alive, but the spirit that once filled her home with laughter had been silent for far too long. Dr. Marcus Sullivan stood at the foot of Emily's bed, his brow furrowed as he reviewed her vital signs. The numbers remained stable, but in his heart, he knew the situation had become stagnant. Emily had been comatose for so long that her future seemed increasingly uncertain. He had seen many cases like this during his career. A patient lies still, trapped between life and death, while their family clings to the hope that one day they'll wake up. But Emily's case was different. He had sensed it from the beginning. In the hallway just outside the room, Emily's parents waited. Sarah, her mother, held a worn-out teddy bear close to her chest, its frayed fur a reminder of the many years that had passed. Tom, her father, paced back and forth, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his jaw clenched tightly as he struggled with his emotions. "How much longer do we have to wait?" Tom finally asked, his voice strained and barely audible. Sarah didn't have an answer. She never did. "I don't know, Tom," she whispered, clutching the teddy bear even tighter. "But we have to believe that she's still in there somewhere. She's a fighter." Tom shook his head and sighed. "I don't know how much more of this I can take. It's been 5 years, Sarah." Dr. Marcus stepped out of Emily's room, closing the door softly behind him. He approached the couple, his expression one of both compassion and concern. "Her vitals are stable," he said, though his voice lacked the enthusiasm of hope. "It's a good sign, but we have to be patient. Recovery from something like this, if it happens, takes time." "How much more time?" Tom asked, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "She's been like this for 5 years. How much longer can we wait?" Sarah placed a calming hand on Tom's arm. "We can't rush this," she said, though her own voice trembled. "Emily needs us to be strong. We have to believe she's still in there." Dr. Marcus nodded. "Your emotional support is crucial. Even though she's unconscious, she might still be able to hear you. Keep talking to her. Let her know you're there." Tom turned to the small window on the door that led to Emily's room. His heart ached as he looked at her motionless body, but as much as he wanted to believe, the years of waiting had taken a toll on him. Inside the room, Sarah quietly took her place by her daughter's side, as she had done countless times before. She reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair away from Emily's forehead. Her voice broke as she whispered, "Oh, Emily, I miss you. I miss your laughter, your smile. Do you remember the trips to the lake? We used to catch fireflies and make wishes under the stars." As she spoke, memories flooded Sarah's mind, each one bittersweet and filled with longing. She had spent the last 5 years clinging to these memories, trying to keep the essence of her daughter alive. "We're all here waiting for you, sweetheart," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your dad, your friends. We all need you to come back to us." The room remained silent, except for the steady beep of the machines. The weight of despair pressed down on Sarah's chest as the minutes ticked by without any response. She closed her eyes, trying to hold back the tears, but the ache of loss was too much to bear. And then, it happened. Emily's eyelids fluttered. It was subtle, so faint that Sarah thought she might have imagined it. But then it happened again, more deliberate this time. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, and she leaned forward, her pulse quickening. "Emily?" she called, her voice trembling with both hope and fear. Tom rushed into the room, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What's happening?" Emily's eyes slowly opened. Her chest rose and fell with a deep, shaky breath, and her gaze darted around the room as if she were trying to make sense of her surroundings. "She's awake," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Oh my God, Tom, she's awake." Dr. Marcus quickly entered the room, his eyes scanning the monitors before focusing on Emily. "Emily, can you hear me?" he asked gently. "Can you respond?" Emily's gaze locked onto Dr. Marcus, but there was something in her eyes, something dark and distant, as if she were trapped between two worlds. "Emily," Sarah asked softly, reaching for her daughter's hand. "Sweetheart, do you remember anything? Can you tell us what happened?" Emily's lips parted as if she were about to speak, but no sound came. Her brow furrowed as though she was trying to pull something from the depths of her mind. There was a heavy silence in the room, a palpable tension as everyone waited for her to respond. Finally, with great effort, Emily's voice emerged, a faint whisper that sent chills down their spines. I remember," she began, her voice shaky and weak. Her eyes flickered with something. Fear, confusion, maybe both. Sarah and Tom exchanged a worried glance, and even Dr. Marcus felt a chill settle over him. "What do you remember, Emily?" Dr. Marcus asked, his voice soft yet urgent. Emily's gaze shifted to him, and for a moment, it seemed as though she might finally reveal the secret that had been locked away inside her for so long. But then, just as quickly as the moment had come, her eyes clouded over again, and she looked away, her expression distant and troubled. I can't," she whispered. "I can't. Remember." Her voice faded, and once again, the room was filled with the rhythmic beeping of machines, leaving everyone standing on the edge of a mystery that would only grow deeper with time. Fractured memories. The next few days were a blur of emotions for Sarah and Tom. Their daughter was finally awake, but the long-awaited moment of joy was shrouded by an unsettling sense of confusion. Emily had woken up, but she wasn't the same little girl who had laughed and played in the yard all those years ago. Something had changed in her, something neither parent could understand. The doctors were pleased with Emily's physical progress. Her vitals were strong, and she had regained consciousness without any major complications. However, her mental state remained a mystery. Emily was quiet, withdrawn, and most disturbingly, unable or unwilling to share what had happened to her before the coma. It had been 5 years since the accident, 5 years of waiting, praying, and hoping. Yet now, even with Emily awake, Sarah felt as though they were farther away from their daughter than ever before. "Emily, sweetie," Sarah whispered one afternoon as she sat beside her daughter's hospital bed. Emily lay motionless, her eyes half closed as she stared out the window, watching the rain gently patter against the glass. "Do you want to talk about anything? You don't have to say anything if you're not ready, but I'm here when you are." Emily didn't respond. She simply blinked slowly, her gaze distant. Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had waited 5 long years for this moment, and she wasn't going to give up on her daughter now. Tom, however, was struggling. The weight of the past years had worn him down. After Emily woke up, he had expected something to change, a return to the normalcy they had lost. But every day that passed without answers, without recognition from their daughter, pushed him further into a spiral of frustration. "Why won't she talk to us?" Tom asked, his voice laced with anger as he paced the small hospital room. "It's like she doesn't even know who we are anymore." "Tom, please," Sarah said softly, her eyes brimming with tears. "She's been through something terrible. We don't know what she's feeling or what's going on in her mind. We have to give her time." Tom stopped pacing and ran a hand through his graying hair. "Time," he muttered. "That's all we've had, Sarah. 5 years of time. And now she's here, and she's gone." "She's not gone," Sarah said, though her voice trembled. "She's here with us. We just need to help her find her way back." Tom let out a heavy sigh and sank into the chair beside Sarah. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room was filled with the soft beeping of the machines that monitored Emily's condition, a constant reminder of the fragile balance between life and death that they had been teetering on for so long. Then, as if sensing the tension between her parents, Emily stirred. Her eyes shifted away from the window and toward Sarah. For the first time since she had woken up, she truly looked at her mother, really looked at her. "Mom." Emily's voice was a fragile whisper, barely audible. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. She hadn't heard Emily call her Mom in years, and the sound of it now was like a long-lost melody. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I'm here. I'm right here." Emily's lips trembled, and for a moment, it seemed as though she might say something more, but then her face twisted in confusion, and she turned away again, her expression darkening. "I don't know where I am," Emily murmured, her voice hollow. Sarah reached out, gently taking her daughter's hand in hers. "You're in the hospital, sweetie. You've been asleep for a long time, but you're safe now. You're with us." But Emily shook her head slowly, as though the weight of her thoughts was too much to bear. "No," she whispered. "No, this isn't right. I'm not supposed to be here." Tom leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do you mean, Em? What's not right?" Emily's eyes darted around the room, a look of panic flashing across her face. She pulled her hand away from Sarah's grasp, curling her fingers into the sheets. "It's wrong," she said, her voice rising slightly. "It's all wrong. I shouldn't be here." Sarah's pulse quickened, and she exchanged a worried glance with Tom. "Emily, you're safe," she repeated, trying to soothe her daughter. "You're with us. We're here." But Emily didn't seem to hear her. Her breathing quickened, and she gripped the edges of the blanket tightly, her knuckles turning white. "No, no, no. This isn't where I was supposed to be. I was. Her voice trailed off as her eyes glazed over, and she seemed to withdraw into herself, lost in some distant memory. Sarah felt her heart break all over again as she watched her daughter slip away, both mentally and emotionally. "What's happening to her?" Tom asked, his voice thick with worry. "I don't know," Sarah replied, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't know, but we have to get her some help." Later that evening, Dr. Marcus returned to check on Emily. He had been closely monitoring her progress. But today, something about the girl's demeanor caught his attention. Emily was more restless than usual, her once blank stares now replaced with expressions of anxiety and fear. "I think it's time we take a closer look at what might be going on inside her mind," Dr. Marcus said thoughtfully, after discussing Emily's condition with Sarah and Tom. Waking up after such a long coma can be traumatic, especially if there are gaps in her memory. It's possible she's experiencing disorientation or even amnesia. "Is there anything we can do to help her?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with desperation. "We can start with cognitive therapy," Dr. Marcus suggested. "It will take time, but we can work on helping Emily regain her sense of self and recover any lost memories." Tom frowned. "You're saying there might be things she doesn't remember? Like us, her family?" Dr. Marcus nodded slowly. "It's a possibility. Sometimes, the mind protects itself by blocking out certain memories, especially if they're tied to trauma. But we'll work through it, step by step." Sarah swallowed hard, feeling the weight of Dr. Marcus's words. If Emily didn't remember them, if she had forgotten everything about her life before the coma, how could they help her find her way back? How could they rebuild what had been lost? As the days passed, Emily's behavior grew more erratic. She often spoke in fragmented sentences, her thoughts disjointed, and her emotions volatile. Some days, she would be calm, almost peaceful, staring out the window as if lost in a world of her own. But other days, she would become agitated, her hands shaking as she muttered to herself about things that didn't make sense. "It's like she's living in two different realities," Sarah confided to Dr. Marcus one afternoon. "One moment, she's here with us, and the next, she's somewhere else entirely." Dr. Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "She may be experiencing dissociation, a defense mechanism where the mind detaches from reality to cope with overwhelming stress or trauma. It's not uncommon in cases like hers, but it's something we'll need to address carefully. One night, as Sarah sat by Emily's bed, watching her daughter sleep, a soft voice broke the silence. "They're coming." Sarah's heart skipped a beat, and she looked down at Emily, whose eyes were still closed. "Sweetheart," she whispered, leaning closer. "Who's coming?" Emily didn't respond. Her face was calm, serene, as though she were dreaming. But her words had sent a chill down Sarah's spine. In the following days, Emily's cryptic comments became more frequent. She would murmur about them, about something coming for her, though she never elaborated on what they were. Each time, her voice was filled with dread, as though she were recalling a nightmare that had followed her out of the darkness of the coma. "They're coming for me," she whispered again one morning, her eyes wide and filled with fear. "I wasn't supposed to wake up." Sarah's blood ran cold as she listened to her daughter's words. What had Emily experienced during those 5 years in the coma? What dark memories or visions had imprinted themselves on her mind? As much as they wanted to believe Emily was back, they were slowly beginning to realize that the journey ahead of them was not just one of healing, but one of uncovering the truth, a truth that Emily herself might be too afraid to remember. Whispers of the past. The hospital hallways felt longer than usual as Sarah walked toward Emily's room the next morning. She had barely slept the previous night, haunted by the words Emily had murmured in her sleep. "They're coming for me." The phrase echoed in her mind, each repetition making her heart race with dread. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Emily had experienced in her coma was far more than just a long, silent sleep. As she entered Emily's room, Sarah noticed her daughter sitting up in bed, her frail frame propped against a pile of pillows. Emily's once vibrant hair now hung in limp strands, and her pale skin seemed even more translucent under the harsh hospital lights. Her eyes, however, were alert, focused and intense, as if she were seeing something far beyond the sterile walls of the room. "Good morning, sweetheart," Sarah said softly, trying to mask the anxiety that had gnawed at her all night. She approached the bed cautiously, her eyes searching Emily's face for any sign of recognition or emotion. Emily's gaze flickered toward her mother, but remained distant, as though she were seeing her through a fog. Her lips parted slightly, and for a brief moment, Sarah thought she might speak. But Emily only sighed and turned her head toward the window, her fingers absent-mindedly twisting the edge of her blanket. "They're still coming," Emily whispered suddenly, her voice barely audible, but filled with a chilling certainty. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Who's coming, Emily?" she asked gently, leaning closer to her daughter. "What do you mean?" Emily's brow furrowed as if she were trying to make sense of the question. Her eyes darted toward the window, and her hands tightened into fists, clutching the sheets. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice trembling. "But I feel them. Watching." Sarah's heart sank. Watching? Who could be watching Emily? Who or what had haunted her dreams for all those years? Before Sarah could ask anything more, Dr. Marcus entered the room, his usual calm demeanor a welcome contrast to the tension that hung in the air. He offered Sarah a reassuring smile before turning his attention to Emily. "How are you feeling today, Emily?" he asked, his voice gentle but probing. "Any changes?" Emily remained silent, her eyes fixed on the window as if waiting for something or someone. "Emily," Dr. Marcus continued, moving closer to the bed, "we've talked a lot over the past few days about what it's like to wake up after such a long time. I know it's confusing, maybe even frightening, but I want you to know that we're here to help. Whatever you're feeling, it's okay to talk about it." Emily's fingers twitched, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I don't remember it all," she said softly, her voice shaking. "But it's like there were shadows everywhere. I was trying to get out, but they wouldn't let me." Dr. Marcus exchanged a concerned glance with Sarah before kneeling beside Emily, keeping his tone soothing and patient. "Shadows?" he asked gently. "Can you tell me more about them? What did they look like?" Emily's breath quickened as if the memories themselves were suffocating her. They didn't have faces, she whispered, her voice barely audible. They were just dark, and they whispered all the time. Whispered things I couldn't understand, but I knew they were waiting for me. Dr. Marcus scribbled a note in his chart, his brow furrowing as he processed her words. He had seen patients come out of comas with fragmented memories before, but Emily's descriptions were more vivid, more terrifying. He wasn't sure if they were real memories or a manifestation of trauma, but either way, they were haunting her. "Do you think they're still here, Emily?" he asked carefully. "Do you feel like they're still with you?" Emily turned her wide eyes toward Dr. Marcus, her lips trembling. "Yes," she said. "I don't know how, but I feel them. They're watching, waiting for me to remember." A cold chill ran down Sarah's spine, and she instinctively reached for her daughter's hand. "Emily, sweetheart," she said, her voice barely steady, "you're safe here. No one can hurt you. No one is watching." But Emily shook her head violently, her hair falling over her face as tears welled in her eyes. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice laced with fear. "They never left. They've been here all along." Dr. Marcus straightened, his mind racing with possibilities. It was clear that Emily's perception of reality was fractured, likely due to the trauma of her coma. But there was something deeper going on, something that needed to be understood before she could fully recover. "Emily," he said softly, "I want to try something with you. I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and take a deep breath. Can you do that for me?" Emily hesitated, her eyes darting between her mother and Dr. Marcus, but finally she nodded. She closed her eyes and inhaled shakily, her body tense with apprehension. "Good," Dr. Marcus said encouragingly. "Now I want you to imagine a safe place, somewhere you've always felt happy or calm. It can be anywhere, your home, a park, anywhere that brings you peace. Can you picture that place?" Emily's brow furrowed in concentration as she tried to summon the image. After a moment, she nodded again. "Where are you?" Dr. Marcus asked, his voice calm and soothing. "The lake," Emily whispered. "We used to go there when I was little. I can see the water. It's sparkling." Sarah felt a surge of hope. The lake had always been a special place for their family, a place where they spent summers, catching fireflies and roasting marshmallows by the shore. It was a memory Sarah had clung to during the long years of waiting. "Good, Emily," Dr. Marcus continued. "Now I want you to stay there, by the lake. Feel the warmth of the sun on your skin. Listen to the sound of the water." Emily's breathing slowed, and for a moment, her tense body seemed to relax. But just as quickly, her face twisted in fear, and her eyes snapped open, wide with terror. "No," she gasped, sitting up in bed, her hands trembling. "They're there too. They're everywhere." Sarah's heart sank as she rushed to her daughter's side, wrapping her arms around her in an attempt to comfort her. Emily's body shook with fear, and her eyes darted around the room as if she were still seeing the shadows from her dreams. "It's okay, sweetheart," Sarah murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "You're safe. I'm here." But Emily didn't seem to hear her. She pushed her mother's arms away, her breathing rapid and shallow. "You don't understand," she cried. "I wasn't supposed to wake up. They didn't want me to." Dr. Marcus stepped back, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of concern and helplessness. Whatever Emily had experienced during her coma, it was clear that it had left deep scars. He knew they needed to approach her recovery with caution, but he also understood that they were running out of time. As the days went by, Emily's outbursts became more frequent. She would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, her eyes wild with terror, claiming that the shadows were closing in on her. Sarah and Tom were beside themselves with worry, unable to comfort their daughter, no matter how hard they tried. One evening, as Sarah sat alone in the hospital waiting room, exhausted from the emotional toll of the past few weeks, Dr. Marcus approached her. "Sarah," he said gently, sitting down beside her, I've been reviewing Emily's case, and I think it's time we consider a more intensive approach to her therapy. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes red from crying. What kind of approach? There's a therapy called EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Dr. Marcus explained. It's used to help patients who have experienced trauma, especially those who have difficulty processing their memories. I believe Emily might be a good candidate for it. It could help her make sense of whatever is haunting her. Sarah bit her lip, unsure. Will it help her remember, or will it just make things worse? Dr. Marcus hesitated, choosing his words carefully. It's difficult to say. EMDR is designed to help patients confront and process their trauma in a controlled environment. It might help Emily remember what happened to her before the coma. But it will take time. Time. It always came back to time. Sarah closed her eyes and sighed deeply. She wanted nothing more than to help her daughter heal, but she was terrified of what Emily might uncover. The shadows, the whispers, the fear in her eyes. It was all too much. But what choice did they have? All right, Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Let's try it. Dr. Marcus nodded, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We'll take it one step at a time. As Sarah sat in the quiet waiting room, the weight of the decision pressed down on her. Whatever Emily had experienced in the darkness of her coma was now casting a long shadow over their lives. And though Sarah wasn't sure where this path would lead, she knew one thing for certain. The journey to uncover the truth had only just begun. Confronting the darkness. Days passed in a blur as preparations for Emily's therapy began. The hospital team coordinated Emily's sessions with a trauma specialist, and though the idea of therapy gave Sarah and Tom a sliver of hope, a deeper fear lingered. What if the process revealed something they weren't prepared for? Sarah watched Emily from the chair next to her bed, studying her daughter's still fragile form. Though Emily was awake, it was clear she wasn't fully present. There were moments when she seemed lucid, where the little girl Sarah once knew peeked through. But those moments were fleeting. Most of the time, Emily stared off into space, her eyes clouded by fear, as though she were trapped between worlds. The one she had known before the accident, and the one that haunted her now. The first EMDR session was set to take place in a private therapy room at the hospital. Dr. Marcus accompanied Sarah and Tom to meet with Dr. Allison Bennett, the trauma specialist leading Emily's therapy. Dr. Bennett was a tall woman with kind eyes, her presence exuding warmth and confidence. She had treated countless patients with trauma-induced memory fragmentation, and though she was aware of the complexities of Emily's case, she remained hopeful. Sarah, Tom, Dr. Bennett greeted them as they entered the room. I know this is a challenging time for you both, but I want to reassure you that we're going to take this process step by step. The goal here is to help Emily confront whatever memories or emotions she's suppressing in a safe and controlled way. Do you think this will help her remember? Sarah asked, her voice shaky but filled with determination. Will she finally understand what happened to her? Dr. Bennett offered a gentle smile. There's no guarantee that she'll remember everything, but EMDR is highly effective in processing traumatic memories. Sometimes it's not about remembering every detail, but about healing from the emotional wounds that those memories leave behind. Tom, who had been quiet for most of the meeting, finally spoke. She's been having these episodes. She says things like, "They're coming," or "They didn't want me to wake up." What does that mean? Is she hallucinating, or are these real memories? Dr. Bennett's expression softened. It's possible that Emily's mind is trying to make sense of fragmented memories from her time in the coma. Sometimes, the brain protects itself by creating symbols or metaphors for trauma. Those shadows she talks about could represent something she experienced emotionally or physically before or during the coma. Sarah nodded, though her chest tightened with worry. The shadows. They had been a constant presence in Emily's life since she'd woken up. Were they real, or were they just a manifestation of the fear that had taken root in her mind during those 5 years of silence? Let's begin the session, Dr. Bennett said, standing and leading the way into the therapy room, where Emily was already seated in a chair, waiting. Her small figure seemed even more fragile under the soft lighting, and Sarah's heart ached as she looked at her daughter, who was now a stranger in so many ways. Dr. Bennett knelt beside Emily, her voice gentle and calming. "Hi, Emily. I'm Dr. Bennett, and I'm here to help you. I know things have been scary for you lately, but I want you to know that you're safe here. Nothing can hurt you. We're just going to talk a little bit, and I'm going to ask you to follow my instructions, okay?" Emily nodded slightly, her fingers gripping the armrests of the chair, though her eyes remained distant. Dr. Bennett explained the EMDR process to her in simple terms, asking Emily to focus on specific memories, while she followed a light that would move back and forth in front of her eyes. It was a way of helping the brain reprocess the trauma, allowing the patient to confront the past without reliving it fully. As the session began, Sarah and Tom watched from behind a glass window in the observation room. They couldn't hear what Emily or Dr. Bennett were saying, but they could see the concentration on Emily's face as she followed the movements of the light. For the first few minutes, Emily's expression was neutral, almost blank. But then something shifted. Her eyes widened, and her breath quickened. Her fingers clenched the armrests tighter as her face twisted in fear. Dr. Bennett's voice remained calm and steady, though Sarah could see the tension building in Emily's body. Whatever she was seeing, whatever she was remembering, was terrifying her. Sarah's heart raced as she watched, her hands trembling. She had expected Emily to be afraid, but seeing her daughter in such visible distress tore her apart. Tom stood beside her, his jaw clenched, his fists curled tightly at his sides. He wanted to burst into the room and pull Emily out of the chair, away from the pain, but he knew they had to trust the process. Suddenly, Emily let out a small gasp, her body jerking as if she had been startled awake from a nightmare. Dr. Bennett leaned closer, her expression focused but calm. She was asking Emily something, likely trying to guide her through whatever memory she was confronting. Emily's lips began to move, and though Sarah couldn't hear what she was saying, she could see the fear in her daughter's eyes. Emily's head shook from side to side, and her breathing became more labored, her chest rising and falling rapidly. And then, as if a dam had broken, Emily spoke loud enough that her voice echoed faintly through the observation window. "They didn't want me to leave," she cried, her voice trembling. "They said it wasn't safe. They told me not to wake up." Sarah's heart stopped. Who had told her that? Who were these they that Emily kept mentioning? Were they real people, or were they figments of her imagination? Emily's body shuddered as the words poured out of her, her voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't see them. They didn't have faces, but they whispered, always whispered, and I couldn't get away from them." Dr. Bennett leaned in closer, speaking softly to Emily, guiding her through the memory. "What did they whisper, Emily?" she asked, her voice calm. "Can you remember what they said?" Emily's face twisted in anguish as she tried to recall the words. Her hands trembled, and for a moment, Sarah thought she might shut down again, lost in the confusion of her fragmented memories. But then Emily spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "They said I wasn't ready, that I wasn't supposed to wake up. They told me. They told me to stay, in the dark." Sarah's blood ran cold. What kind of nightmare had her daughter endured in those long, silent years? And why did it sound as though she had been held captive, not just by her coma, but by something far more sinister? Tom took a step closer to the glass, his face pale. "What is she talking about?" he muttered, more to himself than to Sarah. Who were those voices? Who were those people? Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't. All she could do was watch as her daughter trembled in the therapy chair, her eyes filled with terror, her mind lost in the labyrinth of memories that had somehow followed her out of the darkness. As the session drew to a close, Dr. Bennett gently placed her hand on Emily's shoulder, offering words of reassurance and comfort. Emily's breathing slowed, but her eyes remained wide, filled with the same fear that had haunted her since she'd woken up. When the session ended, Dr. Bennett led Emily back to her room, allowing her some time to rest. Sarah and Tom followed closely behind. Though neither of them spoke, the weight of what they had just witnessed pressed down on them like a lead blanket. Later that evening, after Emily had fallen asleep, Dr. Bennett met with Sarah and Tom in the hospital lounge. "She's holding on to a lot of fear," Dr. Bennett began, her voice calm but serious. "Whatever she experienced during her coma, it wasn't just the physical trauma. Her mind created something, an experience that feels very real to her. And that's what she's trying to process now." "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "How do we help her?" Dr. Bennett took a deep breath. "We continue the therapy. It will take time, but each session will help her peel back the layers of fear and confusion. Right now, she's remembering fragments, bits, and pieces of her experience. But in time, we may be able to help her understand what's real and what's not." Tom ran a hand over his face, his expression one of exhaustion and frustration. "And what if she doesn't? What if she never remembers? Or worse, what if she remembers, and it's too much for her to handle?" Dr. Bennett met his gaze, her eyes filled with empathy. "We'll take it one step at a time. Emily's been through something incredibly traumatic, but she's strong. And with your support, I believe she can heal." As Sarah and Tom sat in the quiet of the hospital lounge, the reality of the situation settled in around them. The journey to uncover the truth was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. But as they looked at their sleeping daughter, they knew one thing for certain. Whatever darkness had followed Emily out of the coma, they would face it together. Into the shadows. Emily's therapy sessions continued over the following weeks, each one revealing small fragments of the terrifying world she had experienced during her coma. The shadows, the whispers, the sense of being watched, they all seemed to swirl together in a nightmarish haze that refused to dissipate. Sarah and Tom watched helplessly as their daughter struggled through each session, her fear palpable, her memories dark and fragmented. Sarah spent most of her time at the hospital, sitting by Emily's bedside, waiting for her to wake from the restless sleep that now plagued her. Emily would toss and turn in her bed, her brow furrowed as though she were still trapped in that terrifying place. Sarah's heart ached as she watched her daughter, unable to soothe the torment that lingered just beneath the surface. One evening, after a particularly difficult session, Dr. Bennett pulled Sarah and Tom aside to discuss Emily's progress. "She's making strides, but it's slow," Dr. Bennett explained, her voice calm but serious. "Each session brings up more pieces of her memories, but they're still jumbled. She's clearly traumatized by whatever she experienced, but we haven't yet reached the core of it. There's something she's holding back, something that she's not ready to face." Sarah bit her lip, her eyes filled with worry. "Do you think she'll ever be able to tell us what happened, or will these memories just keep haunting her?" Dr. Bennett hesitated for a moment, then spoke carefully. "I believe Emily will eventually be able to confront her trauma, but it's going to take time. Right now, her mind is protecting her from something she perceives as too dangerous to remember. But with each session, we're helping her feel safer, more grounded. When she's ready, I believe she'll start to unravel the full story." Tom, who had been standing silently by Sarah's side, finally spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "And what if that story is something we don't want to hear? What if she remembers something that's too much for her?" Dr. Bennett met his gaze, her expression filled with empathy. "That's a possibility we have to consider. But the longer she avoids facing these memories, the more power they'll have over her. Our goal is to help her regain control of her mind, to process the trauma in a way that allows her to move forward." Tom nodded slowly, though his jaw remained clenched. He wasn't sure if he was ready to hear the truth, but he knew that Emily couldn't continue living in fear. They needed answers. They needed to know what had happened to their daughter during those 5 long years of silence. That night, after Emily had fallen into another restless sleep, Sarah sat by her side, gently stroking her hair. She watched as Emily's face contorted in a grimace, her fingers twitching beneath the blankets. It was clear that even in sleep, Emily was still trapped in whatever nightmare had haunted her for so long. As Sarah sat there in the quiet of the hospital room, she found herself thinking back to the day of the accident. It had been an ordinary day. Sunny, warm, filled with laughter. They had all gone to the park for a picnic. Emily had been running ahead, chasing after a butterfly, her laughter echoing through the air. And then, in the blink of an eye, everything had changed. The car had come out of nowhere, swerving onto the sidewalk, hitting Emily before anyone could react. Sarah remembered the sound of screeching tires, the sickening thud of the impact, the way time had seemed to slow as she ran toward her daughter's crumpled body. She had thought Emily was dead. For a few agonizing moments, Sarah had believed her little girl was gone forever. But the paramedics had arrived quickly, and though Emily had been unresponsive, they had managed to stabilize her long enough to get her to the hospital. It wasn't until later that they realized the extent of her injuries. Emily had slipped into a coma, and the doctors had warned them that she might never wake up. For 5 years, Sarah had lived in a state of suspended grief, mourning the loss of the vibrant, joyful daughter she had once known, yet holding on to the faint hope that Emily would somehow return to them. Now, as Sarah sat beside her daughter's hospital bed, she realized that waking up had been only the first step. The real battle had just begun. The next morning, Emily's therapy session began much like the others. Dr. Bennett guided Emily through the process, encouraging her to follow the light as it moved back and forth in front of her eyes. Emily's face was tense, her lips pressed together in a tight line, as she concentrated on the movement. "Emily," Dr. Bennett said softly, "I want you to go back to that place you told me about. The shadows, the whispers. I want you to focus on how you felt when you were there." Emily's breath hitched slightly, but she nodded, her eyes flicking back and forth as she followed the light. Her fingers curled into the armrests of the chair, and Sarah, who was watching from the observation room, noticed the tension in her daughter's body. "I was scared," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't know where I was. It was so dark. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear them." Dr. Bennett leaned in slightly. "What did you hear, Emily? What were they saying?" Emily's face twisted in fear, and for a moment, Sarah thought she might shut down again, as she had in previous sessions. But this time, something was different. This time, Emily seemed determined to push through the fear. "They were whispering," Emily continued, her voice barely audible, "telling me I couldn't leave, that I had to stay, that it wasn't safe to wake up." Dr. Bennett's voice remained calm, though Sarah could see the intensity in her eyes. "Who was telling you this, Emily? Can you remember what they looked like?" Emily's eyes darted back and forth, her breath coming in shallow gasps. I don't know," she stammered. "They didn't have faces. They were just shadows. Always there, watching." "And how did you feel?" Dr. Bennett asked gently. "When they told you to stay, how did it make you feel?" Emily's fingers tightened on the armrests, her knuckles turning white. "I was scared," she whispered. "I didn't want to stay. I wanted to wake up. I wanted to get out. But they wouldn't let me." Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she listened to her daughter's words. She couldn't imagine the terror Emily must have felt, trapped in that dark, silent world for all those years, unable to escape. "What happened next?" Dr. Bennett asked. "Did you try to leave?" Emily's face contorted in anguish, and she shook her head violently. "I couldn't," she sobbed. "Every time I tried to wake up, they pulled me back. They said it wasn't safe, that if I woke up, something bad would happen." Sarah's heart raced as she watched Emily break down in the therapy chair. What was she talking about? What danger could there have been in waking up? "Emily," Dr. Bennett said softly, "you're safe now. You're here, in the hospital, with your family. No one can hurt you. But I need you to try to remember. What did they mean when they said it wasn't safe to wake up? What were they trying to keep you from? Emily's eyes flew open, and for a moment, she stared at Dr. Bennett, her chest heaving as though she were about to scream. But instead, her face crumpled, and she began to sob uncontrollably. "I don't know," she cried. "I don't know what they wanted. I just know. I wasn't supposed to leave. They kept telling me I had to stay in the dark." Dr. Bennett gently placed a hand on Emily's shoulder, offering words of reassurance as she tried to calm her down. But Sarah could see the frustration and fear on her daughter's face. Emily was clearly battling something she didn't fully understand, something that had followed her out of the darkness and into the light of the real world. As the session ended and Dr. Bennett helped Emily back to her hospital bed, Sarah and Tom met with her once again to discuss the progress. "She's remembering more, but it's still fragmented," Dr. Bennett explained. "It's clear that whatever happened to her, whether it was a real memory or something her mind created during the coma, has deeply affected her. The idea that she wasn't supposed to wake up, that she was in danger if she did, is very powerful in her mind." "But what does it mean?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with desperation. Why would she think that waking up was dangerous? Was it something someone told her, or is it just part of her trauma? Dr. Bennett sighed softly. "It's hard to say. It could be a manifestation of the trauma she experienced during the coma, or it could be connected to something that happened before the accident. We'll need to continue the therapy to find out more." Tom, who had been silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke. "And what if she never remembers?" he asked, his voice filled with anguish. "What if she's stuck in this nightmare forever?" Dr. Bennett met his gaze, her expression serious but compassionate. "We're going to keep working with her. It will take time, but I believe Emily can heal. She's already made so much progress." As Sarah and Tom sat in the quiet hospital lounge later that night, the weight of the uncertainty pressed down on them. They still didn't have answers. They still didn't know what had happened to their daughter during those long, dark years. But as they looked at Emily, sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks, they knew one thing for certain. No matter what nightmares lay ahead, they would face them together. The breaking point. Weeks passed as Emily continued her therapy, inching closer to the truth of what had happened to her during the 5 years she had been in a coma. Each session peeled back another layer of the nightmare that had haunted her, but the core of her trauma remained elusive, a dark shadow lurking just beyond the edges of her consciousness. Dr. Bennett had warned Sarah and Tom that the process would be slow, that Emily's mind was protecting her from something it wasn't ready to face. But as the days turned into weeks, both parents grew restless. They could see the toll it was taking on Emily. Her once fragile body was now gaunt, her skin pale and stretched over her delicate frame. The fear that had once only visited her in nightmares now clung to her even during waking hours, and it was clear that something inside her was on the verge of breaking. One rainy afternoon, during what was supposed to be a routine therapy session, everything changed. Emily sat in the therapy chair, her body tense, her fingers gripping the armrests as she followed the light with her eyes. Dr. Bennett's voice was calm, guiding her through the process as always, but there was an undercurrent of urgency in the air. Emily had been unusually quiet that day, her eyes distant, as though she were already lost in the shadows of her mind. "Emily," Dr. Bennett began, her voice soft but firm, "I want you to focus on that feeling you told me about, the fear you had when they told you not to wake up. I want you to go back to that moment and try to remember what was happening around you. Can you do that for me?" Emily's breathing quickened, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Her face twisted in concentration as she fought to bring the memory to the surface, but her eyes remained locked on the moving light, as though she were afraid to look away. "They were there," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "The shadows. They were all around me." Dr. Bennett leaned in slightly, her expression calm but intense. "What did they want, Emily? What did they say?" Emily's eyes darted back and forth, her body trembling as though she were on the edge of something terrifying. They They said I wasn't ready, that it wasn't safe to wake up. But I didn't want to stay there. I wanted to leave. And then what happened? Dr. Bennett asked, her voice quiet but firm. Did you try to wake up? Emily's hands tightened on the armrests, her knuckles white with the force of her grip. Yes, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I tried to leave, but they wouldn't let me. They said if I woke up, something terrible would happen, that I'd be in danger. Sarah, who was watching from the observation room, felt her heart race as she listened to her daughter's words. She had heard Emily talk about the shadows before, but this was different. There was something darker beneath the surface, something that made her stomach twist in fear. What kind of danger, Emily? Dr. Bennett asked, her tone gentle but insistent. What were they trying to protect you from? Emily's breath hitched and her face contorted in fear. For a moment, it seemed as though she might retreat again, lost in the confusion of her fragmented memories. But then, something changed. Her eyes widened, and her body went rigid as though a floodgate had opened in her mind. They were keeping me away from him, Emily said suddenly, her voice loud and clear, though filled with terror. They didn't want me to remember. They didn't want me to wake up because he was waiting for me. Dr. Bennett's eyes narrowed slightly, and she leaned closer to Emily, her voice calm but curious. Who was waiting for you, Emily? Can you tell me who he was? Emily's eyes darted back and forth, her breath coming in shallow gasps. I don't know. I don't know his name. But he was there, watching, waiting. I could feel him. He wanted me to stay in the dark, to never wake up. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she watched Emily's body tremble with fear. Who was this person Emily was talking about? Was he real? Or was he just another manifestation of the trauma she had experienced during the coma? Dr. Bennett's voice remained steady as she pressed on. Emily, I know this is hard, but I need you to focus. I need you to try to remember. Was this man someone you knew? Someone from before the accident? Emily's face twisted in anguish and she shook her head violently. I don't know, she cried. I don't remember. All I know is, he was there, and he was waiting for me. He didn't want me to wake up, and when I did, he was angry. Dr. Bennett's eyes flickered with concern, and she gently placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. Emily, you're safe now. No one can hurt you. But I need you to try to remember what happened when you woke up. Did you see him again? Emily's breathing quickened, and for a moment, it seemed as though she was about to collapse under the weight of the memory. But then, with a shaky breath, she spoke, her voice filled with dread. He's still here, she whispered. He never left. Later that evening, after Emily had been sedated and was resting in her hospital bed, Sarah and Tom sat in the hospital lounge, their faces pale and drawn with fear. Dr. Bennett joined them, her expression serious but calm. What is she talking about? Tom asked, his voice shaking with anger and fear. Who is this man she keeps mentioning? Is he real, or is this just some kind of delusion? Dr. Bennett sighed softly, choosing her words carefully. It's difficult to say. Emily's mind has created a very vivid image of someone, or something, that represents a threat to her. Whether this man is a real person or a manifestation of her trauma is something we still need to explore. But she thinks he's real, Sarah said quietly, her hands trembling in her lap. She believes he's still here, watching her. Dr. Bennett nodded slowly. That's the power of trauma. When the mind experiences something so overwhelming, it can create symbols or figures that represent that fear. Emily may be projecting her fear onto this man, but that doesn't mean he's real. Tom ran a hand through his hair, his frustration boiling over. So what do we do? How do we help her? Dr. Bennett leaned forward, her expression serious but compassionate. We continue the therapy. Emily is close. She's starting to confront the core of her trauma, but it's still fragmented. We need to help her piece it together, to understand what's real and what's not. It's going to be a long process, but I believe she can heal. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she thought of her daughter, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. What if she never remembers? What if she's stuck in this place forever? Dr. Bennett reached out, placing a comforting hand on Sarah's arm. We won't give up on her. Emily is stronger than you think. She's already come so far. We just need to give her time. That night, as Sarah sat beside Emily's bed, watching her sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Emily had spoken of the shadows before, but this was different. The fear in her daughter's voice when she talked about the man, him, was visceral, real. And then, as if on cue, Emily stirred in her sleep. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she stared blankly at the ceiling. But then, without warning, her eyes locked onto the far corner of the room, and her body went rigid with fear. He's here, Emily whispered, her voice trembling. He's watching. Sarah's blood ran cold, and she followed her daughter's gaze to the empty corner of the room. There was nothing there. No shadows, no figures, just the soft glow of the hospital lights casting faint shadows on the walls. Emily, Sarah said softly, her voice shaking. There's no one here. You're safe. But Emily didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the corner, her body trembling as though she were seeing something Sarah couldn't. Her breath quickened, and tears filled her eyes as she clutched the blanket to her chest. I wasn't supposed to wake up, Emily whispered, her voice filled with terror. He told me. He told me if I woke up, he would come for me. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she reached for her daughter's hand, holding it tightly. Sweetheart, you're safe. No one can hurt you. I'm right here. But as Sarah looked into her daughter's terrified eyes, she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching them. The shadows that had haunted Emily's nightmares were no longer confined to her mind. They had followed her into the real world, and Sarah knew that until Emily confronted the full truth of what had happened to her, they would never be free. The room remained silent, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken fear, and though Sarah couldn't see it, she felt it, the presence that lingered just beyond the edges of the light.